Hello and welcome back to the NWR Virtual Healthcare Conference. My name's Matt Wright. Next up, we have Paradigm Biopharmaceuticals, which is listed on the ASX under the ticker PAR. And joining us on behalf of Paradigm today is CEO Paul Rennie. Before we get started, a reminder for anyone who wants to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to type it in using the Q&A panel within Zoom. I'll now pass it over to Paul to give the presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm very pleased to be here and present the Paradigm story. I'm just back from a major international conference on osteoarthritis called AUSI, where many big pharma companies presented their data in relation to research that's going on within the field of osteoarthritis. And I was very, very privileged to see that Paradigm got invited to talk at a clinical trial symposia where other pharma companies, along with Paradigm, spoke about their clinical development progress thus far. And one of the amazing things was that during the meetings that were taken after that presentation, so many people saying that Paradigm had done some amazing things in relation to research with this drug, pentosan polysulfate sodium, and osteoarthritis. Like, for example, we were one of the only companies that presented on biomarkers in synovial fluid. One of the questions that was regularly asked by people from the audience was, had this company done any work in relation to synovial fluid biomarkers? And in all cases except Paradigm, the question or the answer was no, they hadn't got round to that, but they were looking forward to doing that. So I think we really presented a very cohesive, very interesting story, and we had a lot of interest from pharma companies wanting to have further discussion. So it was a very successful meeting, and I'd like to thank all of my Paradigm colleagues who organised the meeting and made it such a success. Today's presentation starts with our standard disclaimer, as we are an ASX listed company. As Matt said, our ticker is PAR. And today I'm going to talk about primarily our lead program, which is the use of this particular compound, pentosan polysulfate sodium, for subcutaneous use, which we refer to as PPS or IPPS, injectable PPS, for the treatment of osteoarthritis. PPS is a non-opioid based drug. It has a 60-year track record and a lot of third-party research in the area of investigating this drug in the areas of treating pain, inflammation, and thrombosis in humans. So we have a very extensive understanding of the drug and its response in the human system. Our lead program is osteoarthritis, which is a major market, somewhere in the region of 10 to 16% of the population have osteoarthritis. And we are now, we have trademarked injectable PPS as xylosol. It is in a phase 3 global clinical study, which I'll explain to you a little bit more throughout the presentation. The osteoarthritis program did get granted FDA fast track, and I'll speak about that a little bit later as well to explain the benefits of fast track. And also we have globally harmonized protocol. And again, when we get into the details, I'll explain what that means, particularly from an investor's perspective. We do have a second program, which is the use of the drug in treating the residual pain in people with the condition of mucopolysaccharidosis, or MPS, MPS 1 and MPS 6 particularly. These patients are treated with a standard of care drug called enzyme replacement therapy. However, those patients are still left with a lot of residual musculoskeletal symptoms, and particularly pain and joint stiffness, and they have seen very significant improvement in their musculoskeletal morbidities as a result of using pentosan polysulfate sodium. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, save for a comment at the end of the presentation. Paradigm has conducted at least 3 phase 2 studies in osteoarthritis, providing very encouraging evidence of meaningful treatment effects compared to placebo, particularly for changing in from baseline with regards to pain, activities of daily living, and the patient global impression of change. We also, under the TGA Special Access Scheme, we have treated over 700 people in Australia with osteoarthritis with very good and consistent results. The same sort of results we're seeing in the real world are also being seen in our phase 2 clinical studies. So in terms of recent announcements from the company, we have, as I mentioned at the outset, we have spoken and been asked to present at the Aussie World Congress, which has just concluded in Denver, Colorado. We have also announced that we have parallel European ethics and regulatory approval for our phase 3 study. So we have regulatory and ethics approval in Europe, and as we also do in the United States. We had positive top-line data from our phase 2 clinical study, which we call PARA-008, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later in the presentation. And in our phase 3 study, we had a formal safety review in December 2022, and we got approval to proceed with the trial without any modifications. So obviously indicating at this particular stage in the phase 3 trial, very good safety outcomes. Mucopolysaccharidosis, we're running 2 phase 2s, MPS 6 being run in Brazil. There's a large cohort of subjects with MPS 6. We're just about to finish the enrollment stage of that phase 2 trial. It is a double-blind placebo study, so a very interesting study, which is gaining a lot of attention around the world in rare diseases. We also have an MPS 1 study, which has finished recruitment in Australia. We're waiting for the follow-up results of that, and then we'll be publishing those. As far as the company goes, our R&D team led by Dr. Ravi Krishnan did successfully have a paper investigating the use of the same drug, pentosan polysulfate sodium, in the acute respiratory disease system. And that was published in Frontiers of Immunology. And we've also actively engaged in discussions with potential partners, particularly around our MPS asset. There's a lot of pharmaceutical companies looking for rare disease assets, and we've explained to them that both of these are well progressed. They're both almost at the end of recruitment in their phase 2 programs, and so it's a very interesting asset to look at partnering at this point in time. We do have a number of companies who are preparing submissions back to Paradigm, and we'll advise the market when those submissions are made. So now I'm going to focus on osteoarthritis. As I think most people know who've seen the Paradigm presentation, know that osteoarthritis is a disease of the entire joint. The disease affects the bone under the cartilage. It affects the cartilage. It also affects the other tissues in the joint, the menisci and the ligaments, and also the synovial capsule, which is the sac that contains the fluid for the joint. That is also significantly inflamed and changes significantly with the progression of the disease. So it's all of the tissues around the joint. We know with osteoarthritis, as I mentioned before, large number of people, roughly somewhere between 10 and 16% of the population affected with osteoarthritis. We know that that number was 72 million plus in 2020. That number is going to grow to 120 million plus sufferers in the US, EU5, Canada, and Australia. Around 70% of osteoarthritis is in the 2 major weight-bearing joints of the knee and the hip. We also know that around 81% of patients are dissatisfied with their current treatments. The disease has really outprogressed the therapies that are being used to treat the patients, and they're largely reporting that those drugs are no longer satisfactory to treat their disease as the disease progresses. We know that in the US alone, OA is predicted to increase by 86% to 67 million people by 2030. We also know that there's in the notes here some indications of how we calculate this particular market size, but basically taking a percentage of this large market and applying a $2,500 per course of treatment to that large number, estimates in the region of around about a $10 billion per annum market for this indication. It is a blockbuster opportunity. We know that Humira, which was for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, generated AbbVie around about $20 billion a year over the last few years. Of course, that is now coming to an end with the approval of a number of biosimilars. So AbbVie's predicting a very significant drop-off in their revenues, but they have had a very good time with the particular product, generating very good clinical outcomes for patients, but also at the same time over a $20 billion a year market. Bear in mind, rheumatoid arthritis is 1/10 the size of the osteoarthritis. So this $10 billion might sound extraordinarily large, but in comparison to other indications such as rheumatoid arthritis, which has a much lower frequency in the population of around about 1% of the population, generating $20 billion, we're talking here about 10 to 16% of the population generating $10 billion. So one could argue that's probably a little on the conservative side. Now, this is our clinical development program. So OA005, this is our phase 2 study, which was completed in 2018. From this particular study, we did get some very good clinical outcomes in terms of reduction in pain, improvement in function, and improvement in joint stiffness. But we also did measure some structural and serum and urine biomarkers of disease. So it gave us a lot of confidence that maybe this drug is doing a lot more than just treating the pain and the joint stiffness. So in 2021, we started this second phase 2 study, which is Osteoarthritis 008. Now, this study specifically looks at, again, the clinical outcomes of change in pain, change in joint stiffness, and also change in function of the joint. But it also looks at structural and also the biochemical disease biomarkers. So this is a very interesting study, and I'll give you an update on that as we go through the presentation. 002, this is our pivotal phase 3 study. And as you can see, started in late 21. Now we're about the middle of 2023. We're about, by the middle of this year, we'll be about halfway through this particular study, finishing towards the end of 2024. 003 is the confirmatory study. So the FDA wants us to do 2 phase 3 studies. So this is the pivotal one, 002, and this is the confirmatory study, 003. And you can see both studies and all of these other adjoining studies will be reading out, and all that data will be compiled for Paradigm to make an NDA application around the middle to end of 2025. So as I mentioned, Para 008, this is a phase 2 study exploring the potential of IPPS as a disease-modifying drug for osteoarthritis. It's a biomarker study assessing the change in baseline in multiple objective measures associated with disease progression of OA. So this can be either the biochemical changes that go on within the joint, and it can also be the structural changes showing a reduction in cartilage volume, for example. So enrolled 60 participants, received IPPS 2 milligrams per kilogram once or twice weekly, or placebo. They're being followed up for a period of 12 months. And at the end of last year, Paradigm reported the top line results, which was day 56. And we showed from those day 56 some very encouraging biochemical biomarkers. And we are now about to report on the 6-month follow-up of all of these 60 patients at the 6-month time point, again, looking at the biochemical markers as well as radiographical markers. What we reported back after day 56 was that we saw that there was a reduction in these biomarkers compared to placebo, and these were the biochemical markers that we measured in the synovial fluid. So NGF, which is the nerve growth factor, it's a pain mediator, reduced in the PPS group, went up in the placebo group. I've got some more data on these here. Very complex slide, but I'll just draw your attention to these are the major biomarkers here: COMP, NGF, ARG, TNF, IL-6, and TIMP. Once weekly, twice weekly, and this is the PPS pooled. So a total of 32 subjects here, placebo 22. And what we're looking at here is to say the change for this particular biomarker, COMP, on average is minus 4.67 compared to placebo. So this is going down, this is going up. Again, a similar thing here for NGF, pooled result of 35.1 compared to 60.3 in the placebo. So nearly 50% reduction in NGF and so on. This is the ARGS. This is the biochemical fragment that is measured in the synovial fluid. It is the breakdown fragment of aggrecan, which is one of the matrices that makes up type 2 collagen. And you can see that that biomarker is going up in the placebo group and so on. Now, it's very important that when we look at these biomarkers, and whether they be the biochemical biomarkers that are circulating in the synovial fluid, or whether they be radiographical changes which occur on X-ray or MRI, it's very important that we also see clinical outcomes that are positive for the patient. So this is day 0, and we're looking at the red line being what's happening in the IPPS subjects. And this is obviously the mean of that group with the standard deviation. And then day 56, which is our primary endpoint for the phase 3 study. It's also the primary endpoint for this 008 study. You can see at day 56, there's a statistically significant reduction in the PPS group on a downward trajectory, whereas the placebo has pretty much leveled out at this particular point. The same for WOMAC function. You see again a significant reduction in the function for the PPS group versus placebo. And this is very important for the regulators. They don't want to just see the biochemical markers. They don't want to just see the radiographical markers. They want to see concordance between those biochemical and those image or structural biomarkers, as well as clinical outcomes. So the FDA has made it very clear, you need to have good clinical outcomes on top of those structural changes that you would see to get a disease-modifying label. So we are exploring the potential of the drug to be a disease-modifying drug, and I think we've explained previously, disease-modifying label on the drug would significantly increase the reimbursement price of the drug, because essentially as people are taking the drug, their symptoms are being reduced, but also the disease is being slowed down, very similar to the effect of TNF in the rheumatoid arthritis disease. So in this Para-008 study, as I mentioned, we're coming up to the 6-month data readout, which we've said will be at the end of Q1. So we're looking a few weeks away before reporting on this 6-month data. We're looking at changes in one or more synovial fluid biomarkers. We're also looking at changes in correlation between the synovial fluid, serum and urine biomarkers, and correlation with changes in clinical outcomes. So here we're saying that we are looking at how the chemical biomarker may change in the synovial fluid and comparing that to the clinical outcomes and seeing that, okay, we've seen a reduction in this biomarker. We're also seeing reduction in the clinical outcomes for the patient. We're looking at changes in WOMAC pain, function, stiffness, and quality of life. And we're also looking at MRI changes in the bone and the joint. So we're looking at cartilage volume, for example. Again, I've got another slide on that here. So these are the structural biomarkers. So this is looking at the actual tissues of the joint, the bone and the cartilage. We're looking at subchondral bone marrow lesions, the area and the volume of those lesions. That'll be evaluated by MRI, and that gives us an indication of pain and cartilage degeneration. We're also looking at the synovial membrane, looking at the effusion or the swelling within the synovial membrane, evaluated by MRI, and again, it's an indicator of inflammation and pain. Cartilage thickness, which gives us an indication of the progression of the disease. We're also looking at the bone shape and osteophytes. These are the bony outgrowths that occur in late stage osteoarthritis, which cause a lot of pain. They'll be measured by MRI. The joint space width, which is the distance between the two bones in the joint. Obviously, the more cartilage, the greater the distance. Less cartilage means there's a less joint space. So again, it gives an indication of adverse bone remodeling and cartilage degeneration as well. Phase 3 program, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, just suffice to say that this has been approved by the US FDA as our adaptive trial design, where we're looking at a stage 1 of testing a number of different doses, subcutaneous twice weekly, subcutaneous once weekly, a fixed dose once weekly, and then placebo. Around the end of June, we will have recruited somewhere in the region of 475 subjects. We will then pass that data across for our data monitoring board to review and determine what is the safest and most effective dose, which will then go into stage 2 compared to placebo. And this will be collectively looking at around about, again, 475 subjects, so making it a total of well over 900 subjects in the pivotal phase 3 study. The confirmatory study will add another 700 subjects to the total number. We do have regulatory and ethics approval in the United States, Canada, and also recently EMA. So we have a harmonized protocol, which means that the data gathered from the study, which is being conducted in all of these countries, will satisfy the requirements for registration in the US, Canada, Europe, and also Australia. At a very similar timeframe, we don't have to then do individual studies in these different geographical areas because we have a pre-confirmed acceptance of the study with those regulators. What's coming over the next 6 months? So as I mentioned, Para-008 will have a 6-month readout of that data at the end of March 2023. We're also conducting a canine natural history osteoarthritis model, a 20-week follow-up, which is equivalent to a 3-year follow-up in humans. So the dog's aging faster than humans. 20-week follow-up equates to around about a 3-year look into the effect of the drug in the natural history of osteoarthritis in a dog. That data will be reported at the end of, it'll be probably in second half of calendar year 2023. We think it will be around about June, but it could actually be a little bit earlier. But again, this will be a very similar study design to 008. We're looking at osteoarthritis, natural history of osteoarthritis, and we are looking at serum biomarkers, and we're also looking at structural biomarkers such as changes on MRI and also X-ray. So this will be a very interesting study to overlay on top of the 008, and then give Paradigm 2 very significant data sets to go to the agencies and say, look, we've generated this data. What more do we need to do to get a disease modifying label? Para-008, 002, our pivotal study, we're still aiming for 100% recruitment by the first half of calendar year 2023. So we hope by the end of June, we'll have announced that we are 100% recruited in that stage 1 of the pivotal study. We do have plans to take the readouts from these 2 studies and then have discussions with the key regulatory authorities, the FDA, EMA, on disease modification pathway and our label once the product is registered. We have progressed significantly on our commercial discussions on the MPS asset, which, as I mentioned at the outset, is our rare disease asset. And that's the end of my presentation. So I've got, I think, around about 5 minutes for questions. Thanks, Matt.
That's spot on. Thank you very much, Paul. As you've mentioned, we'll get into some questions. Once again, if anyone in the audience has a question they haven't submitted yet, please do so using the Q&A panel within Zoom. Paul, the first question is, the company's previously mentioned that representatives of BeNA Pharmachem would visit Australia this year. Is that still planned? And in addition, can you add any further colour on future collaborations with BeNA and whether you anticipate further agreements or enhancements to the supply agreement?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Matt. And our offer with the people from BeNA, we caught up with them at the global rare disease conference, which is called the World Symposia. That was held in Orlando, Florida. We had a very productive meeting with BeNA at that conference. We booked a conference room. We had a day where we presented all of our results thus far on all of the MPS assets because that was a rare disease conference, but we also took them through developments of our osteoarthritis program. They are very keen to visit Australia. I think we just have to find the right forum, and again, we are hoping that they'll be able to attend the annual general meeting and be available for questions with investors around November this year. So yes, everything's still on track there, and we will of course advise investors once we know some firm details, but we do hope to have them here for our AGM.
Thanks, Paul. The next question is, the 2 mg twice weekly was most effective in PAR 008. This dose is not used in PAR 002 stage 1 dosing selection study to decide the stage 2 drug dose. Maximum dose in PAR 002 stage 1 is 1.5 mg twice weekly. Why is this?
It comes back to discussions with the agency that they want to see that we have reached the lowest effective dose. So we have taken the discussions with the agency very seriously, that they are asking for more information around a slightly lower dose because there are many other studies that have shown PPS to be very effective at a slightly lower dose. So the agency presented us with studies that have been done with people that we know, such as Professor Peter Ghosh, who did a number of studies with pentosan in humans. He did 2 phase 2 studies at a lower dose than what we were using. We also know Professor Kenji Kumagai from Japan also used a lower dose. So the agency said, you're using a higher dose and we want you to be able to justify that there's a slightly lower dose has the same efficacy. We did our analysis on our pharmacokinetic study, and in that study we looked at 2 mg per kilogram and 1.5 mg per kilogram, and there was very little difference that we saw, and so therefore we feel that the efficacy of the 1.5 mg will be equivalent to the 2 mg per kilogram twice a week, and that will satisfy the requirement for the FDA to explore a slightly lower dose to ensure that we're close with the Kumagai and the Ghosh doses, and at the same time demonstrating that it's slightly less than our 2 mg per kilogram dose, and we've got a slightly lower but similar effective dose to take into our phase 3 clinical study. But it has all been thoroughly checked out by our experienced pharmacodynamic experts, and as I said, the data from PK studies showed that there was very, very little difference in terms of peak effect, timing, clearance, etc. of 1.5 milligrams versus 2 milligrams.
Thanks, Paul. The next question is around, there's been discussion on presentations by researchers on IPPS in trials regarding MPS 1 and MPS 6. Is that something that is still expected to occur?
Yes, we had representatives at the major World Congress. We had three presentations. We had the principal investigator presenting his findings thus far, although the study is still ongoing and it is blinded. He was unable to give a full assessment other than to say that many of the people in his study have been approached by family members and carers that their patients are responding very positively and they would like to continue on with the drug for a number of years. And we've agreed with the Brazilian regulatory authority to make the drug available to those subjects for a period of 5 years following the clinical study. So we have had presentations at another conference in Salt Lake City just last week, again talking about the studies. The study that is gaining a lot of interest from the MPS community is the study in Brazil, because it is double-blind and placebo-controlled. So many people would understand that with these rare diseases, there is a small number of subjects, and most of the subjects are reluctant to go into studies where there's placebo control because they feel that their time and energy could be wasted but Dr. Giuliani has done a wonderful job in being able to explain to his patients the potential benefits of IPPS, and he's seeing that clinically. And so I think we have an expectation that once that study has finished recruitment, we will quickly move to get all that data assessed and followed up and published. But we think, given it's a double-blind placebo-controlled study, very few drugs in the rare disease space actually use placebos. So this will be a very interesting outcome for us. And as I say, we're already seeing some very positive clinical outcomes. And so we think this will be a very exciting presentation, but we have to wait for the full data set before we can present any of the data from that study.
Great. We're just getting to time, but one really quick one to finish with, Paul, is someone's asked about the OA RSI poster and whether that's something that will be made publicly available. Can you just respond to that?
Yeah, sure. We expect to make that available. Matt, I did show some of the slides from that poster today. We'll put the full poster up on the website at some stage and probably do an announcement. Yeah, it is expected to go onto the website for sure.
No problem. I'm conscious that there's a few other questions in the queue. I will make sure Paul or Simon or someone in the team gets back to those people, but we've just run short of time. So, Paul, thanks very much for that presentation today and taking the time to go through everything.
Well, thank you, Matt. And could I also thank NWR for the invitation, and also all of the attendees who spent the time to join the meeting today. But I would also just like to thank again all of my Paradigm colleagues who've done quite an amazing job in bringing the clinical data from many different studies, progress it through with all of the regulatory approvals, and progress so quickly and so thoroughly. So thanks to everyone involved. And thank you, Matt.
No worries. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.